guys, today we'll walk through my top 5 tips on how to write strong lists for Warhammer 40,000. And without further ado, let's dive right in. My tip number 5 is understanding your army. It might sound very obvious, but believe me, a lot of people actually play their factions just because they like the models, the lore, and they don't really get a deep look inside what the codex, what the faction is really meant to do. And to have a chance to succeed, you really need to understand well what your particular force is designed to do by the developers of the game. Sometimes, if you're an experienced player, you will actually encounter things that developers did not include or did not foresee, and that's where we usually have some meta-changing things or things that require an FAQ. But sometimes you are lucky enough so that your new idea will go under the radar and you will be able to use it for a while. So that's why you should always keep an open mind and don't just go and copy lists from internet. Going back to the original topic, anyone who tries to play Drukhari like they are Custodes is going to encounter big problems and will probably fail at some point. Because even though Drukhari and Custodes are both very good in melee, but they are very, very different factions with very different focuses. You should ask yourself questions. Is your faction good in melee? Is it good in shooting? How fast is it? And so on. A lot of things we will not go through how to analyze your lists or your faction now, but these are just some basic things. Answer to these and more questions will dictate how you build your successful competitive list. And if you answer these questions incorrectly or misunderstand, that may pose you some problems. For example, Custodes are much better in melee than they are in shooting, and if you were to misinterpret that and focus too much on the shooting aspect, thinking that, okay, I have a double shoot on my Custodian Guard, I should probably stay away from the fight or something like that, or have only just tanks, and more tanks, 3 Land Raiders, 3 tanks, Cavaliers, Grav tanks, and I don't know, some Sagittarium Guard units that can shoot reasonably well, then you are probably missing the point of the codex. If you read through the stratagems, if you read through katas, for example, you should very easily understand that this is a faction that is mostly centered around melee, and that's where you should excel. Sometimes even rereading your codex after you have already read it several times or probably looked at it at least through several times may be a very good idea at understanding or reinforcing how your faction can be used. This tip is numbered 5, but actually I would say this one is probably one of the best I can give, because if you don't understand your army, it's almost impossible for you to use it well. Next advice is your list must be deadly. Yes, there are some exceptions where you can actually win the game without really interacting with your opponent much, but these are few and far between and usually are an indication that something is wrong with the current state of 40k. I would not concentrate on that, and it's a very common problem among beginners in Warhammer 40,000, and I can see that quite often in tournaments when I'm playing against someone, is when I see a pretty balanced list with a lot of variety and probably even some idea behind all that, but it lacks a very important component. And that component is the ability of the list in general to concentrate enough firepower or combat damage, preferably both, in one spot to neutralize the threat that the opponent is presenting to you. I feel that a lot of beginners are deceived by some of the more experienced players when they hear the phrase mission play is the most important thing. And don't get me wrong, mission play is the way you score victory points, and victory points is how you win games. However, the path that you actually go through to achieve those victory points in most cases lies through simply destroying your opponent's units in a very particular way, in a particular time, in a particular place on the board, but still, getting rid of your opponent's stuff is extremely important. So anyone who tries to go around that or tries to concentrate more on the mission play units and only have the very, very particular amount of shooting and damage, if you are a very proficient player, maybe that can work for you, but for most of you out there, I would recommend to have something that can actually fulfill requirement of being deadly. And we'll talk more about that in my next tips. By the way, just a quick reminder, if you want my help building your rosters, Space Marines or other factions, or want me to prepare you for tournaments, check out the links to my Patreon in the description. Thank you for your attention, and we continue. The third one is having speed in your list. It's a very common problem again that I see in lists of my opponents in tournaments, and that is a relative lack of fast assets. Worse than not having them is having not enough to be actually able to use them properly, just like having one small unit that you can throw somewhere and not being even positioning it properly during deployment. That is the worst case scenario, is when someone tried to do the right thing but then actually failed to understand the reason why they need that chaff unit there. And in general, those speedy units can be either expensive and damage dealing or specifically chosen inexpensive throwaway units, and both can act as something that provides speed to your list. I see a lot of interesting ideas thrown out around by the players regarding the speed aspect of a list, and for some reason a lot of players think that you positively must have a ton of chaff units, and without that your list will fall and just not work. If you think about how professional, you can say, players construct their list, they do have chaff units very often, but they fulfill very particular roles. And if someone has a list that does by its essence have a lot of stuff flying around, being fast, being all over the board, they don't need as much of the throwaway chaff as a list that has just a few slow dreadnoughts, for example. So I am of the opinion that you can get away with having just some, depending on what your other units are, some chaff units. And if you have, say, a blob of dreadnoughts walking towards midfield objective, you don't have to have two or three or more chaff units to cover that objective as well, because dreadnoughts will do that nicely by themselves. The reason to have chaff units is, for example, when you don't want to engage your opponent already and you want to try to get them to react, and you just throw a unit onto an objective and make them come out and shoot that off. But in most cases, this will only work with less experienced players that will take the bait, not understanding what it means, and will show their important assets in return to something that costs 60 points. Still, it is important to have that option in your pocket, in your toolkit. So in general, being able to be in multiple places in the board at once is an almost mandatory requirement for a winning list. It doesn't always have to be chaff units, though. That's what I want to get across. My tip number 2 is ranged output, and this can take many forms. It's not just shooting, but you're almost always going to be better off having some ability to reach out and touch your opponent's assets without interacting with them in combat. So it can be something like a psychic power like Thousand Suns have, or the Vortex of Doom that Grey Knights have. It can be relatively short-ranged but mobile units that you, for example, deploy from Deep Strike, or they're just fast so they can get across the board. Or some long-ranged assets like Gladiator Lancer, for example, that can reach out and touch something 60 inches away. In any case, your damage should have a way to be delivered, and delivered at range, because there are a lot of ways your opponent can manipulate how you can apply that damage if you can only apply it in combat. Yes, there are factions like World Eaters, for example, talking about combat, that for them it's difficult to fulfill that requirement. Those lists will actually have to pay a substantial tax to compensate for the lack of that ranged output by including some extremely fast units, assets that can deliver that damage. And those players will have to solve those problems individually for each particular list, but still I would say if you could have some relatively good or at least somewhat decent shooting in World Eaters, it would be much better than without that. Even if proportionally that would cost you a bit more than the same amount of damage in combat. Because even some basic screening can provide a very big obstacle for your melee units if they are the only way you can deliver that damage. In most cases, if you can include the ranged output, sorry for the typo, you should do that. And moreover, I always recommend to check that the amount of shooting you have included can actually destroy some basic types of targets, like say a toughness 10 or 11 or 12, or preferably tank with some reasonable rolls on the dice. The Terminator unit, like a 5-man Terminator unit, what can your stuff do to Terminators, and what can your shooting do to a relatively numerous brick of light infantry? Having that understanding will help you even with tip number 1, understanding your faction. This includes understanding your particular list and what it can and cannot do. And lastly, have a way to take a punch. So Warhammer is often going to present you with a situation where you have to cross the distance between you and your opponent on the board, and you need to weather the storm of their shooting after perhaps you have already shot with your guns. It also works the same when you, for example, have to stay on the objective and you need to stay there no matter what, and you need to score that primary in order to win the game. And to have that ability, you need some tough unit. Of course, for different factions, this goal is going to look very different. So, for example, for Drukhari, it can be as simple as including a unit of Grotesques or Talos instead of another boat with Incubi or Kabalite warriors. Obviously, for Drukhari as a faction, toughness is a relative thing, so even the Grotesques are not going to be as tough as, say, a brick of Deathwing Terminators. But still, you can include that layer of durability, or you can decide not to, and then you will probably face consequences. For Space Marines, it can be something like opting for Land Raider, investing a bit more in it instead of a couple of Impulsors, or choosing the Uphold the Honor of the Emperor Vow for Black Templars instead of the one that gives you extra hits or something like that. No matter what your faction is, you need to have something that is capable of acting as a sponge for your opponent's damage. Even better if that sponge is so inefficient to shoot or fight with that your opponent will be actually losing on the efficiency, whilst still being forced to engage it because it's dangerous, or it is on an objective that they cannot otherwise take away from you. So when you are constructing a list, think about things that will be targeting you, things that will shoot you, things that will fight you, and how well each of your assets can actually withstand that. And if you find that any fight that you go into, you lose or you crumble after, you might want to reconsider your unit choices. Again, for different factions, it will be different. For Drukhari, yes, you don't have to worry that your 10-man squad of witches is going to be shot to pieces by a unit of intercessors. It is not the point. The witches should not be shot at before they do their damage because they have the boats that can deliver them. So don't take this advice too literally. It works different for each faction. So let me know what you think about these top 5 tips. I personally use each and every one of them whenever I'm building any kind of a list, no matter if it's competitive or it's meant to be competitive or it's just a casual one. Just any good 40k list needs to almost always follow these 5 guidelines. And I'll see you next time.